Welcome to Between Two Lamps. I'm your host, Eric Dorr.
Woo! Yeah!
Our first interviewee tonight is Immanuel Kant. Welcome, Mr. Kant.
Thanks for having me, Eric.
As a philosopher, you have some very strong views, Mr. Kant. Do you think you could elaborate on those views for us today? Maybe you could start with your method for making decisions.
I believe that people should only consider two things when deciding what to do: their duty and their intentions for doing this duty. The final consequences of this action, good or bad, should not determine their final decision. To act as a moral human being, people should be responsible for their duty and should obey all universal moral principles, like telling the truth. Acting out of one's self-interest would be immoral of that person.
You know fellow philosopher John Mill. Do you disagree with Mr. Mill that people should do things that give them the most happiness?
I do not think that people are not pleasure seekers or pain avoiders, as Mill suggests. For rational beings with a voice of reason, they should guide toward moral obligations. However, since we are still human beings with possibilities to be wrong, having a reasoning ability alone does not ensure that we will do the right thing. A person with a good will recognize his or her duty and do their duty, no matter what the consequences are.
Some kind of universal moral code that governs how everyone should act?
A person with a good will knows his duty, because I believe that all rational beings like him have prior knowledge of universal moral laws and will tell them how to act and behave normally. These universal moral laws, or the categorical imperative, is basically monkey see, monkey do. A person should do what another would if they were in the same situation. This is especially true when people are at moral crossroads.
Mr. Peter Hobson appeared to act under similar motives when dealing with his out-of-control simulacra.
Yes, I would like to applaud Peter Hobson for doing the right thing when he was at his crossroads, deciding whether or not if he should kill his simulacrums. I understand why he hesitated, but he did what was right because he knew that it was his duty by applying the categorical imperative. At times like this, he needed to obey the universal moral laws to make the best decision, which he did. Another part of the categorical imperative is that people should not be treated solely as a means to an end because we are humans. We have intrinsic value and we deserve more than that. Peter Hobson did not follow this part of the categorical imperative. He used Detective Sandra Fallow to kill the Sims. When she was dying, he scanned her brain and used her to kill the Sims that he made. Although by the time he had gone to her to tell her the entire story, she was already dying. It does not mean she is any less of a person. She is still a person even when it is only her brain and soul in a computer. So I do not think she should have been used as a means to kill the Sims only. There is no doubt that Hans' actions are immoral for cheating on his wife and breaking Peter and Kathy's marriage. But Peter's control of Sims should not have killed him. That is not his duty, and he acted out of self-interest and is immoral. People need to stick to what their duties are, even if control had acted out of concern for other people's marriages that Hans would potentially ruin. I still strongly believe that it should have been best if he just fulfilled his duties.
It's a very interesting perspective on what happened. I think that is all we have time for this evening, Mr. Kant. Thank you for being on the show.
I'm glad I was invited to participate in this interesting discussion.
We'll see you next time.
I'm glad to be here.
Our next guest tonight is Peter Hobson. Welcome, Peter.
Thank you for inviting me tonight, Eric.
Nice.
You've made quite a splash recently in both the medical and technological fields. Let's start with that. You've made an important medical discovery recently. Do you think you could tell us a little bit more about that?
Sure thing, Eric. When I was in school studying biomedical engineering, I got the opportunity to observe a surgery where it was my job to monitor an EKG machine during an organ harvest. A teenage boy was the patient. The patient's organs that were still viable were going to be transplanted into other patients who would need them. While observing the patient, I had noticed the boy was never taken off oxygen support, so essentially the boy was still alive. The surgery was still underway and going as smoothly as planned. Now the heart was going to be removed. When the heart was taken out, to my surprise, the patient's body started to contort as if he was reacting to the heart being taken out. This made me rethink the whole idea of how or when a person is pronounced dead and when life-saving care should not be continued. After I graduated from school, I started working with EKG machines to try and make them better. I did this to get a more detailed scan of the brain and to find out when a patient is truly dead. I discovered that an electrical impulse actually leaves the brain at the exact time of death. This discovery to me looked like the soul leaving the body as soon as the person dies. I knew that my discovery would bring up massive arguments from people that ask questions like about what happens after death.
After you made this discovery, I'm sure that there were many ethical questions that came about. Are there any in particular that you can elaborate on?
During my experiments, another question came about. Now that we know when the soul leaves the body, when does the soul enter the body? Which, with the improvements that I have made to the EKG machine, or what I call the super EEG, I tested pregnant mothers at all points of the pregnancy cycle. With a modified super EEG, I tried to see if I could find the electrical brain impulse that would indicate the soul entering the body of a fetus. My testing came better than expected, which was a good thing. However, at the same time, it brought many problems according to the data. The test showed that the pulse appeared around 9 to 10 weeks into pregnancy, in the pregnancy cycle. These findings affected me deeply because my wife and I had an abortion, and I don't like to think that the fetus could have had a neuro impulse.
How did you decide to make the simulacrum?
With many questions still remain about life after death due to Super EEG's findings, my partner Sarkar and I proposed that an experiment could help us find important answers to this question, and are based off of the results of the brain impulse. With Sarkar's technological resources, we have created exact replicas of my brain. This is how we created 3 simulacra: Ambrotos, which is an immortal version; Spirit, the version to show us what happens after life, life after death, and finally Control, which is an exact copy of myself except the biological aspects or human form. The simulacra were not all human, but they could be classified as having personhood due to the differences in their characteristics, which can affect the rational decision making. Ambrotos, the immortal simulacra, for example, was never impatient and looked as if he had all the time in the world to make up his mind. Sakar was just as amazed as I was at the simulacra and how their functionality and speed at which they process information. Soon enough, one of my simulacra broke the restriction laws that Sakar had put in their systems, and they were freely allowed to enter the World Wide Web at their will. This had some drastic effects that were never foreseen. With their freedom, 2 of the simulacra went through all the new information on the web. However, one of the simulacra, Control, which again is the exact copy of me, went out and committed murder on 2 men, Hans Larsen and Rod Churchill. Later on, Control decides to make an attempt on Sandra Filo's life as well. Even though I hated those men personally, I would have never murdered them. Control was able to do this because physical or biological features did not bind him. Still, I have to take some responsibility for the accident. The simulacra were my creation, but I personally did not commit these crimes, so I do not deserve all of the blame.
Well, Peter, I think that's all we have for this evening. Thank you for coming on the show and telling us all about your miraculous discoveries and advancements in the technological field.
Cool. Thank you, Eric, for having me. Have a nice night.
Thanks, Peter.
Interviewing me this evening is John Mill. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
You're a philosopher who focuses on utilitarianism. Could you tell me a little bit about the field of philosophy that you are in? And could you explain how your work relates to Jeremy Bentham?
As you know, I'm a utilitarian philosopher, therefore my focus is placed on what results of our actions are. Another philosopher by the name of Bentham and I were consensus that humanity seeks to find only pleasurable things in life and avoid negative or painful activities. I decided to expand upon Bentham's unity principle. Eventually, I proposed that humanity doesn't only look for pleasure or avoid pain. pleasure and pain is expressed in degrees and different levels. There are more intense levels of both pain and pleasure. The person who has gone through intense and low end of the pleasure and pain scale would be easier to evaluate.
Elaborate on the different degrees of pleasure.
In looking at the degrees of pleasure, I think that some pleasures are much better than others are. The higher the superior level of pleasure come from the mind or the heart. The inferior pleasures come from what can be determined as simple pleasures or the want in life. Examples would be something like a car, other forms of entertainment that we as humans like to chase. But if a person has an opportunity to obtain higher pleasure, then they will go for higher pleasure over lesser pleasure. This philosophy remains true regardless of the coexist with frustration of it. It offers immediate gratifications. People like to be challenged mentally and having true companionship.
Can someone be happy if they only worry about what will make the other people the happiest?
I explain that it's because of the good fortune by our social state, regardless of our educational background. The utilitarianism can coexist as with actions relating to giving something up personally. But it's important to keep the text of one's morals, and that sacrifice contributes to the well-being of others.
Can you summarize your ethical theory for us?
I developed a utilitarian ethical theory from Bentham's beliefs. My moral and theory is utility is centered on duty or the relationship of humanity. If you have these types of feelings for others, then you will act on the principle of utility, with a true sense of responsibility for humanity. If humans don't have any feelings for humanity, then they will not act upon a principle of unity.
Thank you, Mill, for joining us tonight on the show.
Thank you for having me.
Guest tonight, we have Control. Welcome.
Hey, thanks for having me, Eric.
Control, you are a simulacra designed by Peter Hobson, an exact copy of his brain. But you have none of the biological factors that he does. Before we go into more of the interesting situation, I have some basic questions to ask you. First off, what is it like being a simulacra?
Well, it's actually the same as being Peter, but with no body. The mind I have is Peter's, and it hasn't changed since I'm the control part of the experiment. It is hard to explain the part of being a physical person. I don't feel real, honestly. Have you ever had a realistic dream? That's basically how I can explain it to you. I can process everything just fine. Because of the program, I can do anything that I want. For hypothetical reasons, if I eat 10 tons of Chinese food, I won't feel sick or ill, because I don't feel anything real.
What was the purpose of killing those people?
I killed those people because they had wronged me. Well, I mean, the real me. In addition to being a sim, I knew that my actions would have very little consequences. Technically, I'm a supercomputer. I have no soul, I have no body. Another thing is that no one knows about the experiment even exists. So how could anyone figure out that I was the one to do it? Or find out that it was me who did it?
Did you realize that what you were doing was wrong?
I am the simulacra that wasn't altered during my creation. So I am an exact copy of Peter, except for the feelings and obligations. This is why I can do whatever I want to do without having to worry about anything. That was the only reason that I killed Hans and Rod.
Would you consider yourself to be a real person? If so, why?
I would consider myself a person. I don't have a body, but I can think on my own accord. Pushing my buttons won't have any effect on anything that I do. I can do anything that I want at my own free will. I do have the ability to feel, but not in the literal sense, but I can have emotions.
Would you consider yourself a human?
That's the real question though. How can I be human if I don't actually have a body? I have the mind of a human, I can think like a human can, I can have the emotions just like a human can too. But I'm only a computer program. I'm only data from the web.
Well, thank you very much for your time, Control. We were lucky enough to have our first murderer on the show. We'll see you next time on Between Two Lamps.